Clocks. Thanks, Mark. My name is Danielle Randolph, and I am one of the advocates, the only advocate right now, at Abner Weicker, and I work in all three states that we practice in, so Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that allows me to have a nice overview of the different laws and procedures in all three of the states. Some fun facts about me, background history, I suppose. I previously was a school psychologist and a special education administrator. I still hold my Ohio school psych license, so I'm still technically licensed in the state of Ohio. I'm also a mom to four kids, and I homeschool my four kids, so we have a busy household, lots going on. My oldest is in soccer, and he's a huge soccer enthusiast, and right now he's actually playing in a showcase. So I'm waiting for some updates to see how that's going for him. But today I am presenting on aid supports and related services. And so we're going to kind of dive into what related services are, some legalities behind those, practical applications, and then dive a little bit deeper into paraprofessionals and aid support. Related services are the supportive services or abilities, I apologize, activities necessary for some students with disabilities to maximize their educational outcomes. They can assist students with disabilities by helping them to participate in the general education curriculum with their peers, to meet their annual educational goals, and to take part in extracurricular and non-academic activities. That third one gets lost sometimes. We really think about it related service providers in the context of the school day. However, related service providers can also be supports outside of that, whether that's, and again, aid support on the court or an athletic event or to take part in field trips. So we want to make sure we capture the students' needs and any extracurricular non-academic activities that might require some related service supports. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some different related service providers that we typically see on IEPs. And as you see at the bottom, we have paraprofessionals. Now, again, I work in three different states, and there are three different ways to write IEPs or more, honestly. But in many states, related service providers can include a paraprofessional. The state of Michigan, it's a little bit different, and we'll go into that a little bit further. But certainly we have, speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, school psychologists also can provide some supports on an IEP, as well as mental health providers, interpreters. These are all individuals that could be on an IEP to provide those additional services. A related service provider is somebody who is knowledgeable and an expert in their area or field. The IEP team as a whole are the individuals that determine which related services are necessary for the student to succeed in school. And these are all the needs are based on current assessments and the student's developmental needs. So that's why it's important that we have current assessment data to determine the needs of the student so we can make sure that they're receiving all the services that they need to be successful. Under FAPE, we know that special education is provided at no charge to parents. This includes all related services as well. Something that's interesting that some people don't always realize is that related services can be removed from an IEP without a reevaluation if data supports the removal. So we don't have to have a reevaluation to remove an SLP or an OTPT from an IEP, as long as the student maybe has met their IEP goals or we have current data supporting that the student no longer needs that service. That is a bit different, of course, for a case manager, an enrichment specialist, special education teacher. We wouldn't be able to remove them from an IEP because they're the ones providing that core specially designed instruction. Related service providers can either work on their own with a separate goal, or they can be tied to another goal that someone else is working on. Sometimes we'll see a goal for written expression, and we'll have the special education provider work with the student on, how to get their thoughts on paper. And we have maybe an occupational therapist working on those fine motor deficits. So you could have, again, two individuals working on the same goal. We could also have a related service provider assisting the child with modifications and accommodations. Sometimes we see these providers push into the classroom and support the teacher as well as the student, and they may be then listed in the IEP under the accommodation section. Providers also can provide supports to parents and connect the family with outside resources. I have to say, I don't often see this on an IEP, but those related service providers are an integral part of this core IEP team that we have for a student. And oftentimes they do have connections outside in the community. And so it's important that, they're invited to the meetings, that we make room for them at the meetings and allow them to share those resources. Unfortunately, related service providers are not required members of the IEP team. And so sometimes when we're scheduling meetings, that individual or those individuals, can't make the meeting and they're not attending. And I know for myself and a lot of clients I work with, that can be upsetting because those individuals often know a lot about the student and can speak to the student's needs, their strengths, their weaknesses. And so I think we need to press a little bit more in schools to ensure that these individuals can attend our meetings. So what are some legal requirements for related services? Well, IDA says that related services and supplementary aids and services shall be provided to enable the child to advance appropriately toward attaining their annual goals, be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, and participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities. Although the goal is to provide related services to the greatest possible extent in the least restrictive environment, we know that service delivery can be provided on a continuum. And this means that they can be provided through a consultative basis. So again, that related service provider could just be working with the teacher and talking with the teacher about the student's needs. We see this a lot with sensory supports, where that occupational therapist will work with the entire team or the teaching staff, and they'll talk about what the student needs and what they could benefit from in the classroom. Sometimes we'll have an SLP on an IEP, a lot of acronyms, as a consultative service because that student may not need direct services, but again, maybe they just need some support in the classroom setting. Sometimes that individual will push in to the general education classroom, so they'll provide support and resources while the student's in their general education classroom. Or of course, they can also be pulled out into a separate setting. Additionally, related service personnel, they can provide supports through the multi-tiered system of supports or MTSS. So they don't have to just work with students who have disabilities. And we have a lot of providers that I've seen in different districts who provide these interventions to hopefully, right, build the skills the student needs, bridge that gap that they have, so that way they don't need direct services. I have a district in Ohio that I've worked with who has really, the SLP specifically has provided a lot of interventions for this one particular student. And over the course of 2 years, they've improved and they don't need an IEP. And they never really needed to be evaluated for one because that SLP really did provide some really intensive direct interventions. Now we're going to talk briefly about Section 504 and related services. This is something, again, we don't see too often. Districts tend to be hesitant to add any sort of direct provider on a 504 because honestly, they don't get reimbursed for those services like they do under IDEA. And so we get a lot of pushback, but I want everyone to know that you certainly can ask for these providers to be on a Section 504 accommodation plan. And certainly if a student doesn't need an IEP and they don't need that level of support, then it would be appropriate to have someone on a 504 plan to provide some aids and services, some additional support so that student can be successful. So under Section 504, we can have a related service provider on there to provide anything that the student needs so that they can access the general education curriculum and they can reach the same level as their non-disabled peers. That's what Section 504 really is made for. So while related services, oh, I see that pop up. So I just talked about this, or I'm talking about it now, I suppose. So hopefully everyone says true. that related service providers and aid supports can be on a 504 plan. So aid supports haven't got to yet, but as I said before, paraprofessionals and aides do fall under those related service providers. So again, like I was saying, they're not explicitly defined in Section 504. However, technical guidance and assistance from OCR indicates that related services do refer to developmental, corrective, and other supportive services, which include psychological, counseling, and medical diagnostic services and transportation. So when you look really into the law, it does show that the aids and services, like is in the second bullet point, that aids and services should be on a Section 504 plan if the student needs it, and that would include all of our related service providers. So again, in a nutshell, we can put related service providers on a Section 504 plan. So now we're going to jump into aid support a little bit more specifically. We have different types of aides that help around in our schools. Some of them are classroom aides, and that could be an educational assistant who works under a classroom teacher and helps out with the entire classroom. We see this a lot in preschool or kindergarten classes because those are young people just learning how to do school. And so they may have a classroom aide support person who is there to help everybody be successful. As students get older, it's less common to have a classroom aide, but there may be one who, let's say we have a few kids in a grade level who would require that additional adult support. Well, the district or the school building may have that aide travel between those students. So it wouldn't be technically a one-on-one aide, it would be more of a classroom aide because they're there to assist several students as well as the teacher. We do also have one-on-one aides, and that would be a dedicated assistant who's working directly with the student who has these needs and requires a high level of support. This individual is tied to that student. And so they are there to provide really whatever the student needs. Maybe it's to allow them to take breaks, to be removed from the classroom. Maybe it's to reinforce skills that the case manager or special education provider is working on. Could be somebody who's working on behavior supports and trying to intervene if the student's starting to get escalated. So that person, like I said, gets to know that student really well and can hopefully see antecedents or things that are bubbling up. In Ohio, aides should carry an educational and paraprofessional license and work underneath an educator. So again, in Ohio, we have a specific license that is required for educational assistants or paraprofessionals. That's not the same in Michigan and Pennsylvania. So in those states, the individual has to pass a background check. Maybe they have to, again, be board approved, but there isn't a specific license that they have to have. Again, it's a little bit different in Ohio. So let's talk about aides on an IEP. So if the student needs an aide, we want to make sure it's written into the IEP. As some of our presenters have already commented, schools don't have a lot of money, and we hear a lot of restrictions with personnel because of financial setbacks. And so we want to make sure that the aide is written into the IEP so that way the student's receiving the aide support. And if for some reason the aid support isn't being provided, we can come back and file a complaint or ask for additional supports. So it's just really important to get it written into the IEP or 504 if the student requires that level of support. Classroom aides are typically listed on the IEP under the section titled Support for School Personnel, or in Michigan, we see it under the Supplementary Aids and Services, because their duty is really to support the classroom teacher. This individual can support any student that needs additional assistance in that class, but it's not devoted to one particular student. Schools may use this section to note that a student has access to an aide. And we see, again, that written into the IEP a lot. The student will have access to an aide when they're in the general education classroom. That could also include specials. But again, it's often written in there they have access to. The difficulty that I have with the aide being under the support for school personnel section of the IEP is it really doesn't speak to the service that the individual is providing the student directly. And it really does speak to how they're supporting the classroom or that teacher. So I'd like to advocate for the aide to be listed under related services or even accommodations because the responsibility is to assist that one particular student, and we can have it noted very specifically in the IEP what that individual's doing, maybe even tasks that they're helping with. In Michigan, like I said, we have the supplementary aids and services section of the IEP, and that's where we would see the aid. They don't really have a separate section for them under related services. But in Pennsylvania, their section of the IEP is listed. I believe it says supplementary aids and services / related services, and that's where the aid would be listed. And then in Ohio, again, in section 7 of the IEP, it could be in multiple areas, but I would really prefer to see it under related services or accommodations. Again, for me, it just gives that extra level of security that we're going to have that person be with the student. If it's under support for school personnel, it's not always, again, dedicated to the one student that needs it. What are some legal requirements for aid support? So IDEA does require that children with disabilities be in their least restrictive environment, or LRE, to the maximum extent that is appropriate. Now, sometimes a student will need an aid to ensure that they can be in their LRE. Paraprofessionals do provide some really great services and supports for our students. Again, maybe that's allowing them to leave the classroom if they need to. Maybe it's checking in with them frequently to see how they're doing, to see what their level of anxiety is, to see what supports they need. And so having that individual with the student can really allow that student to be pushed in and have access to the general education environment where maybe they wouldn't be able to if they didn't have that aid support. And so again, IDA does say that the use of supplementary aids and services can be necessary, and paraprofessionals fall into that category. Further, IDA requires that students receive a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, and make meaningful progress on their IEP goals. So if a student's disability limits their ability to make progress, an aid may be necessary to support the child's skill development. We see a lot of aids that can, again, be very beneficial to a student's IEP development and just their growth overall, because they can be there and provide that direct support when they need it. It's really difficult for a classroom teacher or a special education provider to be there all throughout the day next to the student and be able to reinforce the skills that are being taught. Like I said, in Ohio, our aides generally fall under a special education provider. And so we have a partnership where they're working together and communicating about the student and their growth, their needs, their progress. It helps with data collection, so your progress reports are more accurate. And so I just want to emphasize the aid can be extremely beneficial to students that require it. But again, it's the requirement that we usually hear from the district when we have some pushback, is a district will say, well, that child doesn't require that level of support to be successful in the classroom. And so what we come down to oftentimes is data. So a lot of districts will collect data through observations, interviews perhaps, to check in and see if that student really does need that extra level of support to be successful. And if you're getting pushback from your district, that would be my request to them. Start collecting data. Start looking in the classroom, or really any setting. Could be during transitions, getting specials, recess, lunch, and see if the student's really struggling. And it could be struggling socially, could be social emotionally with their emotional regulation, could be attention to task. Any of those things that are hindering your child from making progress, an aid could be a successful support for them to really remain with their non-disabled peers. So data is what we always say, because that's really your proof to show that the student needs any support, related service provider, special education supports, aids, whatever it may be. Getting data and documentation is huge. So I was really stepping out of myself, wasn't I? So practical solutions. So what should you do if you believe your child needs the support of an aide? I just said this. Decisions are driven by data. You need data showing that your child is not successful without the addition of a support person. And it might make sense to try the support of a classroom aide first. I know some districts will do that. If they have a classroom aide who they can maybe move around a bit to still have access to the student, maybe that again is more of a least restrictive strategy to see if an aide is needed, or even just at this level of a classroom aide can be really what that student needs to be successful. Consider other supports that might give you the same result without the need of an aide. We know some districts just can't hire aides. A lot of our rural districts, I find Michigan is more hard pressed than Ohio, it seems, to get good, solid paraprofessionals. And so sometimes I had a school one time who posted for the position and just didn't get anybody. So sometimes districts may make a really great effort to get somebody in, but they can't find anybody, or it takes time to get somebody. Or again, maybe the student doesn't quite need that level of support, but we know they need some support. And so trying to figure out what other ways the school can really support that student without maybe needing a paraprofessional. Because one of the downsides we see is the student can become over reliant on the aide. And this can lead to diminished independence, limited social opportunities. I've seen some of my clients who are on the autism spectrum who already struggle socially. Well, now they have somebody beside them who they can talk to. And so they're not maybe going to seek out those opportunities with peers. Or a student may not ask their teacher for help because they have the aide there who they can go to and ask. And so we just want to make sure that if there is an aide, that we're not seeing this over reliance on that adult who's with the student, because we don't want that person to hinder the student's progress. We want to make sure they're supportive. And usually we'll see down the road some sort of plan to, remove that aid or to lessen the time they're with the student, because naturally we want that student to be less reliant or to have, fewer needs for that adult. So that's very typical for schools to want to do some sort of plan where they're dialing back that adult support. Now, RBTs, which are registered behavior technicians, I've had a lot of clients and families who've asked if they can get an RBT in the school to support their child. And so there are some training programs that will allow a paraprofessional to get an RBT certificate. So I want to say it's maybe 20 or 30 hours. It's not, and I could be way off base, but it's not a whole lot of extra time to become an RBT. So maybe 20 or 30 hours might be too much. But it is a little bit extra training, and it's a little bit extra training in behavior. So that individual will have a better understanding of the student's behavior and how to address problematic behaviors in the school setting. So RBTs can be extremely valuable, but they're not out there everywhere. And a lot of schools don't hire RBTs. Again, I know some districts in Michigan that do have their own RBTs. In Pennsylvania, we have some districts that have really fantastic, like autism support classrooms that will have their own RBT. And so those are great resources. In Ohio, not so much. We don't tend to see RBTs in schools. There, and I don't really know why that is. But I haven't seen them, at least in my practice. Maybe some other people out there have. But the IEP team would have to agree that an RBT is necessary to provide that student with a FAPE. I have been successful through a state complaint and getting a district to contract with an outside agency to bring in an RBT to support that student. And that RBT was acting as a one-on-one aide pretty much. They were with the student all day, and they were really there to prevent problematic behaviors or to intervene if something did arise. And so again, that came through a state complaint. So I think sometimes you have to put more pressure on the schools to again do what's necessary or do what the child needs. But there are RBTs out there. They can provide a valuable resource to the school in general as well as the student. In Ohio we have the ESCs, in Michigan we have the ISDs. In Pennsylvania, I'm gonna forget the acronym, but in each of these states we have these sort of intermediate agencies that work with many different school districts. And a lot of times those, may have other supports that we can lean on or other connections that we can, go through to find some additional resources for schools. Because again, sometimes schools want to do what's best for the child, but they just don't have the resources. And so being able to be open to finding those resources is really that team approach. So I went super quick. I was trying to talk slowly, so I didn't go so quick. But here we are at the end. So hopefully we have some good questions to, I guess, lengthen my time a bit.
Hi, Danielle. Yeah, we have one here that
Okay.
it says, with respect to Ohio paraprofessional license, is there a requirement that there be a license to be a one-to-one aide?
It's the same license. So it's just a paraprofessional license. I'm honestly not sure what's required to get that license. I'm assuming it's some sort of training that probably isn't very lengthy. But it would be the same license for a paraprofessional. So schools will use again an aide, and that aide could be a classroom aide or could be a one-on-one aide. A lot of schools will use them wherever they're needed, but it's not a different certification.
I do see that the certification for what they call an educational assistant, which I think includes aides here, is Ohio Revised Code 3319.088. I'll put that in the chat too, but so there are, requirements for obtaining the license through the Department of Education. Yeah,
Perfect. Thank you for finding that.
sure. Was there any particular surprising difference you saw or between the three states?
I have found that Pennsylvania, at least in the clients that I've worked with in Pennsylvania, they are more open to having aides. And maybe it's because they have more aides just employed in their district, but I have not run into an issue with having an aide or an IEP for any of my Pennsylvania clients. Honestly, I have one client who we were asking to remove the aide because the school was saying they needed it and we were saying they didn't. So I would say Pennsylvania, at least in my experience, is a state that we don't have to press really hard to get an aide. I would say in Ohio, Michigan, it's probably even, honestly. In Ohio, I think it's really hard to get a one-on-one aid because I think there's few and far between. And so districts want to use the resources they have to help all kids. And so we see a lot of classroom aids or some, supports that can be provided, but not so much one-on-one aids. And then I would say Michigan, because because it's not listed under the section we have our related service providers, it's more so listed in a different section. So sometimes it can be a little bit flexible on how often that individual's working with the child. So I don't know. I guess similarities, but some differences as well.
Thank you,
Got it.
Danielle. I have a question that one of my clients is experiencing right now. Their child is assigned, well, not right now because it's summer, but very recently, their child was assigned a one-to-one aide with a very specific instructions in the IEP of what the one-to-one aide is supposed to support within the classroom. And the parent had been observing within the classroom and noticed on multiple occasions that the aide might, because of the size of the classroom, it was also kindergarten, so it's younger students, perhaps the aide would go help leave the student alone and go help out with another student, or if the student was in a small group working with the teacher on reading or writing, maybe at like a group table with five other students and the teacher, the one-on-one aide would kind of walk away from the student, go to the other side of the classroom, and help out other students in the classroom, and by whatever means. What would your take be on that? Is that one-on-one aide following their duties, and what could the parent do about that?
And that's why it's really important to have the one-on-one aid under the related service section because then we have minutes tied to that individual. Otherwise, it can be a little bit more gray on how often that aid's supposed to be working with that child. I don't think it's uncommon for that aide to sometimes, or for an aide to sometimes, get up and work with somebody else if that one individual student is working on a task that's requiring attention and they seem to be okay. But I do think it gets uh, it gets a little icky, right? Because then I just think it opens the door to then the classroom teacher using that aid for other things that they shouldn't be doing. like I have heard of aides in the copy room making copies or things like that that aren't even working with students. So I really think our aides need to be protected. And I would say for that individual, your client, I would definitely voice the concern and bring it up because if it's on the IP that that aide is supposed to be doing X, Y, and Z and they're not, then again, file a state complaint and hold that district accountable. That's why we have the complaint process. So that would be my advice. And certainly, if they're able to keep track of what the aide is doing. And even with sometimes we have kids come home and say, so and so wasn't with me today. Or I know Megan and I had a case where a student was supposed to have an aide in gym and that aide wasn't there. I don't know where they were at, they weren't there. And that student then did something that caused a suspension and expulsion. And so I think it's really important to get ahead of it. So if the parent finds out that the aide is doing something else that's not supporting the child or they are violating the IEP, I just think it's important to, again, be proactive, speak up, state your concerns, and see if the IEP team can work together to address the concerns. And if that doesn't work, then file that state complaint because it would be violating the IEP if the aide's not providing those services that are written into the IEP.
Thank you, Danielle. And I was going to say part of you kind of got my attention on that. The aide was leaving, like, and the teacher might use the aide to, go make copies or something. Part of what was happening with the student, not only were there occasions where the student might be, in a small group setting rather than having that one-on-one aide with them. Sometimes the general ed teacher, whatever teacher in the classroom, would leave to go attend an IEP meeting for a student,
Mm,
and then the aide would be just the person in the classroom monitoring those students. And I think you would probably agree with me that that likely is not appropriate if it's just that one-on-one aid for the whole classroom and that student needs the students
correct.
for medical
Yeah.
services and behavioral reasons and safety, really.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we wouldn't want that individual to be responsible for a whole classroom full of kids if they needed to address that individual student. Aides, again, they're not allowed to provide specially designed instruction. They work underneath a special education provider because they are not allowed themselves to provide SDI. And so I had another case where we found out that the aide was the person, really providing all those direct services to the child, not the intervention specialist. So that would be a violation because under their license, they're not able to do that. They're again just a support person to make sure the students, needs are being met, but they can't really provide that direct instruction.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we actually do have a couple more questions in the Q&A. And I'm going to read this question, then I'm going to ask you to expand on it a little bit. So the question is, have Central Ohio school districts, which is Danielle's in Central Ohio, have
Mhm.
Central Ohio school districts been agreeable to writing aids under accommodations or related services? Since that's what you said that you prefer, and then kind of jumping off that, what have you seen since you work across states? What have you seen across states on that ability, or I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but that willingness to write the aid under that section?
So I'll start with the latter part of the question. So again, in Pennsylvania, the way the IEP is written, it's really a catch-all area of the IEP that is related services as well as the supplementary aids and services. So it's already kind of on there as a related service. In Michigan, we don't have a separate section. We just have that supplemental aids and services, and then we have sort of where the minutes are. And I've never seen an aid written into the minutes on a Michigan IEP. They're always written under the supplemental aids and services section. In Ohio, I've seen both. And I would say in Central Ohio specifically, I can think of 3 districts where I have had success having an under related services. I would say it's generally speaking across the state, it's usually your more affluent districts. The districts who work well with families and are really child-centered. I think some of the other ones where we where we see a lot of difficulties, the ones that have, financial issues or we know a lot of complaints come from. And so, I mean, the law says that it can be under related services or accommodations. So there's nothing barring a school district from putting an aid under that section if it's a one-on-one aid. I think sometimes districts don't understand why you would want them under that category. They also, I think, don't understand what support for school personnel means. I found that kind of coming into this role from the school-based sector I was in. I honestly didn't know because I was trained as a special ed supervisor to write them under support for school personnel. But now we know that obviously the way it's labeled, support for school personnel, it's not child focused. It's for the teachers. And so I have good success in a number of districts to have it under related services or accommodations, but not all. And there are some districts that have done it the same way for so long, they're not going to change their direction. But again, the law would say it could be under related services. So I'd really just try to push when I can.
Danielle, we have a similar question, but it's about a 504 plan.
Okay.
Wondering if you've ever been able to have a teacher consultant written into a 504 plan. The situation here is it's a high school student, and the family's thinking that the student should have a case manager because the 504 is complex. There's lots of teachers involved at the high school level.
So a night teacher consultant tells me you're from Michigan. So I would say I have had I have had a TC on a 504 for check-in, check-outs mostly. Because I agree, it's helpful to have a point person for a student, especially one who has maybe ADHD, executive functioning needs. It's really helpful to have somebody who that child can go to or who's responsible for some additional services. In Michigan, I've successful having a mental health, worker on there as kind of a case manager to meet with that student every week. So I'd say yes. I think it's absolutely doable to have that teacher consultant on the 504 plan because they do serve a little bit of a different role than a special education provider. Now that's where I would say you're going to be less likely to get again a special education teacher, intervention specialist on a 504 plan because they're really providing that direct instruction. However, I will say this year I was able to push for um a reading specialist on a 504 plan who was providing direct instruction. I think they're meeting with the student once a week, maybe 30 or 45 minutes a week doing Orton Gillingham. And the student really, didn't have a whole lot of needs, but had some maybe dyslexia specific needs. And we were able to push for that. And that was difficult. And it took a lot of pushing because again, districts aren't used to writing these types of services into a 504 plan. They see a 504 plan as accommodations, extended time, frequent breaks, things like that. But as I shared in one of my slides, you are able to put supplementary aids and supports on a 504 plan. And that's the way I was able to sort of spin my request for that reading tutor, that reading specialist, as I was adding it under there. So I think sometimes you have to take the law, and the law can be a bit gray, right? There's some interpretation in there. But being able to really use that as your leverage for why you're asking for what you're asking for.
Thanks, Danielle. It's so
Yeah.
insightful to learn from your knowledge. We
Yeah.
have another one. This one is an IEP. So there's some toileting goals that are involved. The parent offered to bring in their own aid paid for by a separate funding source to help with the toileting issues. The district refused, and they also refused to include it as a goal in the IEP, despite there are medical recommendations to support it. So besides filing, what else could a parent do?
Bringing in outside providers is just really, really difficult. And I'm not sure why. And I know we internally have talked about this at our firm because a lot of districts will not take a princely paid individual. I had a client up in Michigan who had a BCBA that they were willing to bring in like 30 hours a week. And it was insurance paid. And the district said, nope, because the child doesn't need it. So I just think there's a resistance from the school personnel to accept outside support. I'm not sure why. I don't really know. But so I would say it's probably gonna be difficult to get the school to agree to allow that aide to come in to help with toileting because under IDEA, I mean, it's the school district's responsibility to provide any supports or services that the child with a disability requires. And so I think that's what it would fall back on is the school would have to agree that a student requires this support. They require an aide to help with toileting. If they agree that that support was necessary, but they could not provide their own personnel or couldn't hire somebody, then perhaps they would be open to having your outside aide come in. But I'm betting it's because they don't see a need to have that one-on-one support, which is why they're probably declining that offer. Now to have a goal on the IEP, again, I've seen it. I've seen goals, but I've also been in districts that push back on goals for toileting. I would come across as, again, a daily living goal, adaptive behavior goal. So if it's possible to make more of an encompassing goal that targets a number of different difficulties that your child's having in the area of daily living skills or adaptive behavior, and then having toileting being an objective, perhaps you'd have better luck there. Because for some reason, I have had pushback on from districts with just toileting goals specifically, even though we've said, academic, developmental, and functional needs, right? That's what IDA says, and toileting is certainly a functional need. But I hear that you're getting pushback. I've also gotten pushback with that. And so I've been successful with being able to incorporate into maybe a larger goal that the district agrees needs to be addressed.
Danielle, I just wanted to jump into because just to kind of point, you were quoting some of the IDEA and the needs that a student or that an IEP should cover, including not just academic, but functional needs as well. The purpose of the Individuals with Disability the IDEA, we all know what it stands for by now.
Mhm.
But the purpose of it is to prepare students for further education, employment, and independent living. And to me, that independent living, to prepare them, would include those toileting needs, especially. And then secondly, there could also be an argument, perhaps if because the student doesn't have, or perhaps if the student is missing significant classroom time because they have to be transported to be changed or what have you, perhaps that can be a reason for having a goal, is because we want them in class as much as possible. So they should be working on those toileting skills so they're not missing so much class.
Yeah, I agree with you. And even with the Section 504 plan and having, a related service provider assist with those sort of adaptive behavior needs, again, we've gotten pushback on that as well. And so I think that maybe districts just aren't used to writing these types of services into IEPs and 504s because they are so focused on academic needs. So again, sometimes I think it's just, knowing what they don't know, right? And it takes maybe education on our part as parents and advocates to teach them that it's okay to write these things into plans. They're not going to get in trouble for it.
Yeah, someone commented and was wondering if perhaps the resistance to allow outside aides to come in was due to the outside aide being a mandatory reporter. I'm
Mm.
not sure. I mean, possibly, but also so are the school district employees. Liz had jumped in and said that she thinks it's more because they don't want to be on the hook for hiring or paying if the parent doesn't want to continue sending their own aide at some point.
Yeah, I think there could be a lot of different things at play. And I guess the first point that you made, Renee, I think sometimes districts don't want outside people in the building because they don't want someone else seeing what's going on, honestly. I think that's why sometimes they push back on parents even observing because they really want to, I don't know, restrict the outside view from what's happening on the inside. But yeah, I agree, Liz. I think oftentimes school districts, they don't want to say that the child needs this service. And by agreeing to allow an outside provider in, they are saying that they need that service. And so I would agree with you there.
Danielle, we have one piggybacking off of your earlier comments. A classroom aide, not a one-on-one. Should that also be under related services?
No, in my opinion, because that individual can work with other students. And so an IEP is individualized and that classroom is not an individual support. And that's why they would be under the support for school personnel because they're supporting the classroom teacher or the grade level, the school building, whatever it may be. They're supporting the school personnel, not the individual student. Having it on the IEP under support for school personnel, it just allows anyone who picks up the IEP to see that the student does require that support. But I would say, if you can push for it to be an accommodation, I just think it adds a little bit more weight to it being needed for that student. So while it would not be under related services, I do think you could probably push for it to be under the accommodation section, because you are saying that the student requires, again, that additional adult to, again, maybe take breaks or to work through any sort of anxiety or emotional dysregulation they're experiencing, or if it's a medical need, it can be under the medical section. But I do think you could have it maybe, again, a little bit more specific and individualized under the accommodation section versus support for school personnel. It just depends on what that aide's doing and their responsibilities.
Thanks, Danielle. We have about 5 more minutes for questions. So if anyone has any lingering questions, you're thinking about something, go ahead and pop it in the chat. But Danielle, I just wanted to ask you about the importance of forming a positive relationship with the school. And what happens if that derails with the parent, how you get it on track? Anything about, the importance of relationships in the whole scheme of things?
Yeah, I think the best way to maybe improve a relationship that's deteriorated a bit is really try to come back to what everyone should be at the table for, and that's the student. And coming back to really the core values of what we need to do to support this student, because sometimes, and that's why I had on one of the bullet points of, sometimes a parent or a school can be really hyper focused on pushing for something. But if we can maybe have an overarching goal in mind and be creative and collaborative in how we're going to get to that goal, we're going to have a better relationship, and we're going to be able to repair a relationship that maybe has been, has been hurt or dissolved. So I see that as really kind of one of my roles of coming into working with a client is, repairing the relationship with the school district, because that child's going to school every single day. And as a parent, you're going to have to interact and collaborate with the school staff. And so it's really important that you guys can be on the same page. So I think having communication and collaboration is really the two top tenets of having a strong relationship with the school district. And if at any point in time, again, that conversation, that communication derails, trying to get back on the same page by focusing on the student.
Danielle, I have a question. Have you had the occasion to consider assistive technology as a related service? And then if so, where do you think that belongs on the IEP?
Because Ohio has a separate section for assistive technology, it would go under there. But again, in Michigan, it would go under the supplemental aids and services section. And in Pennsylvania, would go under that. So I think it would honestly go under the same sections, and Ohio would be, again, section 7, but that assistive technology section. But that's a good question. I'll be honest. AT for me is a bit confusing, and I think it's a very confusing for districts, because in all the districts that I work in, I can tell you that they perceive AT differently. Some people will say, well, the student doesn't need AT because they don't have a communication device. It's like, guys, it goes far beyond just communication devices. But I think assistive technology, maybe I should do that next year. Maybe I should learn more myself and share out. I think assistive technology is one of those topics that we don't know a whole lot about, but it's very important to a lot of students. So I think it should be on an IEP if the student needs it. Same with assistive technology evaluations, right? Those don't happen. And I'll ask for one, and the school's like, what? What's that? And who does that? So but under IDA, right, we can ask for an assistive technology evaluation. So I think that whole sort of I don't know, the whole sector of assistive technology is something that we need to know more about, because we need to advocate for it, right, for students and parents need to advocate for their children. So I'm answering your question with a non-answer, right? It goes in the same spot, but I think we need to know more about it and see how it can be, how we can be more impactful in our advocacy for assistive technology.
And since I'm unmuted, I'll ask this next question that came up. It said, get assistive tech evaluation under an IEE question mark?
I mean, you could if you can find a provider. That's been, I guess, my my roadblock is being able to find providers. There are, at least in Ohio, there are districts who have someone internally, oftentimes in bigger districts, who do assistive technology evaluations. Smaller districts, that doesn't happen. Sometimes, the different educational service centers will have somebody, or like Ocali, OSU. There's some things that you can go through, but it's just not out there. And then Pennsylvania and Michigan, I'm trying to even think to myself if I've ever had an AT evaluation done, and I can't think of one. So I'm not sure, honestly. And even if you did an IEE, I don't know where you would go. And I think a lot of districts are open to bringing in outside providers for assistive technology evaluations because they don't have anybody internally and they don't know where to go. So I think if you know of somebody that's somewhat local that you can suggest to the school team for an evaluation, I'm willing to bet they're going to be open to it and having that person evaluate.
All right, we have about 1 more minute. A few comments that our attendees can look at in regards to assistive technology in the Q&A, but one question is, what guidelines do you share with parents with regard to involving their student in providing input? I know it doesn't always make sense to have students in meetings, but I'm always looking for ways to get feedback and input from the student into meetings, even if the kid isn't there themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you because I always say at a meeting, the students' words are way more powerful than ours. And when we have evaluations, in my opinion, a comprehensive evaluation is understanding the child's perspective. So if your district's ever doing an evaluation, they're getting rating scale or they're using rating scales to get information. There are rating scales for children or for adolescents. So I would really, again, advocate and push for the district to include your child in the evaluation process because that allows us to have a better understanding, again, about how they see the world and how they see themselves in school. So to me, that's step one is being able to get their viewpoint when you have that, comprehensive evaluation that's done through the school district. But when it comes to an IEP meeting, we have that section of IEP where we have parent input, parent concerns. I think we need to get children concerns and input too. And I will say, in Ohio, mostly, I do think our providers do a good job of talking with the student ahead of time, especially as we're getting to that transition age, because they kind of have to. But I think it should be, I wish it was a separate section of the IEP because I agree with that person who posed that question. I think it's so valuable to have the student's viewpoint. I had one student I worked with who I loved, and him and I would just talk, and I would be able to get so much from him that he wasn't able to share in the meeting. I was able to share for him, which was just really impactful in the changes we were trying to make. So yeah, I think anytime we can get a child, and even if they can write something down you can take to a meeting, anything that you can do to get their words at that table is just going to be so valuable. And you're not going to find too many teachers or educators who are going to argue with a child, or argue with what they're saying or what they think their needs are. So yeah, it's a very powerful tool to use.
Thank you, Danielle. That is all the time we have for your presentation. But of course, if anyone else has any questions that they would like addressed, we will be having our next Q&A panel of attorneys and advocates at 4:00 p.m. today. But first, we have one more presentation by Mark Weicker at 3:00, but we will take a short break before that. If you could please, during that break, fill out the evaluation for Danielle's presentation. She did a great job and she really values your feedback. And make sure you are answering the poll questions for engagement when they pop up during the presentations. Thank you again, Danielle, and we will be back at 3:00.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.